Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Church of God Network podcast. My name is Daniel Russo. I'm board chairman of Church of God Network. And on today's episode, I'm going to be sitting down with Bob Ucci. Bob Ucci is a longtime friend. In fact, he's known me since I was 3 years old, so about as long-term of a friend as I could possibly have. He's an addiction counselor, at least a retired addiction counselor, and has a lot of experience on the topic we're about to discuss today, and that topic is addiction, compulsivity, and sin in the Christian life. Bob, I'm going to get him to talk about his professional background. I'm going to get him to talk about his personal experience on the subject, and of course his professional experience and his insight into addiction and compulsivity and how it relates to really every person, not just your cliche examples of an alcoholic or someone who's abusing substances. Of course, they fall into this category as well. But really, we're going to talk today about the universality of addiction and compulsivity in the human experience. We hope you get a lot of value out of today's episode, and we hope you enjoy. Well, thanks for joining us, Bob. I appreciate you being on the podcast. I was thinking about this the other day. We actually have known each other quite a long time. Were you in Westchester when my family first moved up?
Yeah.
Yeah, so you've known me since I was 3 years old.
I was in Yorktown when your family moved to Yorktown.
Yeah, that's wild. So for everyone listening, Bob and I are members of the same congregation in New York. We've known each other for a long time. One of the reasons why he's on this podcast is we tend to have, not only him and I, but him, my father, the different people in the congregation tend to have these conversations related specifically to addiction, compulsivity, sin, things of that nature, because they're right within Bob's wheelhouse. And I thought it was good that we have him on the podcast and talk about this topic, because I actually don't hear this talked about much at all in the Church of God. Bob, I don't know if you were able to listen to it, but we featured a sermon by Rick Stafford just after we launched about addiction, and he's a minister in LCG, and it was actually quite good. So if you haven't been able to listen to that, I highly recommend it.
Yeah, I hadn't heard that.
Yeah, but again, welcome. Bob, would you mind giving us a little bit about your professional background?
I worked since 1988 in the field of addiction. I started out as actually somebody heard me speak someplace and invited me to send my resume to a program for United Hospital, which I didn't do, and then he called me again. And then he ended up, I was in a plumber's electrician's union, and he called me because things got slow in the union. My dad was a business agent and all that. You don't jump the line for family, so he called me in the middle of the summer, actually early beginning of summer. I wasn't working, and he had no credentials. I went down there, and I worked with him, and he really liked me. 3 years later, I was the director, and then I worked there 10 years. We had what was considered the best day rehab program in Westchester. We had, it was full service. We had a GED track. We had a life skills track. You get a lot of people in outpatient treatment, inpatient treatment who've been in prison. And we had a woman from BOCES who taught them how to write resumes and could actually help them fill in these gaps in some way that was productive. We also had, at a time when nobody had them, some company donated 6 computers. So the patients would come when I opened up at 7 in the morning and want to get on the computer. I didn't have a computer in my office. We had computers in a room they could use, and they were learning how to write resumes on them. So it was a really unique program. And we had a family of origin piece. And we had an abuse abandonment. We had the only trauma track in the county. So we got a lot of people who came to us who could not get sober, because when they got sober and they started to become, open, they felt frightened and vulnerable and relapsed, kind of like taking away somebody's predominant defense mechanism, which is their drinking and drugging. After a while, it can make them feel, awful, like little children, and they're lost. But we knew that. We knew there were a lot of people who could not get sober if their primary trauma or family of origin issue wasn't addressed. And that was an educational process. And then it was an experiential process. And that was like a 6-month process with them. So I did that for 10 years. And then I got recruited at Columbia New York Presbyterian by Dr. Straightner. And we opened up the only program in the country of its kind. It was an amenities unit. It attracted nothing but celebrities. We had 5 billionaires in the first year. And we had everybody. We had people from Saturday Night Live. We had Academy Award winners. We had doctors who patented famous very prolific procedures. So I was there for almost 24 years, and I retired in January. So
Awesome.
That's how I got into it. It was something that I just, out of my own experience in the past, I was interested in addiction and had my own, personal experience with it, and felt it had some skills that could be useful that I'd learned along the way. And I enjoyed it. It was a good field to be in for a while. You're not going to get rich in the field, but you'll make a living there.
Yeah. So you did one-on-one counseling as well as group sessions, right? Yeah.
I taught for 8 years through both places. And I taught group therapy and group dynamics. I taught relapse prevention, Psychoanalytical Institute in Mount Kisco. I taught over at Nyack Hospital, Rockland Council, Division of Alcoholism and Substance Abuse, a bunch of places. And I did individual counseling, which is fine, but I loved group counseling. And that was my forte. I could get people very invested, interested. I could find out where people were at and kind of meet them there. And I was always kind of validated for the fact that I could, take 15 unruly patients to get them to sit, take notes, and then come back the next day on time. They liked that. And I think it was just a different approach. I think I'm generic. Anybody could have done it. You just had to have the right approach to them.
Sure.
You had to engage them. You had to really, the biggest problem is a lot of people underestimate how bright and how creative people who have a substance use are. First of all, they got to be creative to get their drug of choice every day, and to make the excuses to try to avoid the people that love them or the people they're responsible to. And they're pretty smart. And when you kind of interest them, and I would teach them about the neurophysiology of addiction. I'd make it real simple. I had a great teacher, guy that saved my life, Dr. Paul D'Amico. So I would teach them about that, and they'd understand it was a disease. And the interesting piece was family. I ran a family program as well. And the family program was 2 nights a week. And the parents on the retreat was Sundays, actually. The parents were furious. Every time the person said, I'm going to stop, they bought into it. And then the person didn't stop. And they were so betrayed and let down and disappointed. And when I taught them, I did it on a blackboard. I do it on a blackboard about the neurophysiology. One man said to me, this was on the retreat. These were the very wealthy and movers and shakers in our country. And one man said to me, well, you mean my son really meant to stop? He meant it? I said, yeah. I said, but when your son stopped, he went into withdrawal. And, now he's got a conflict between what his head wants to do, he doesn't want to use anymore, and his body, which is now has cellular craving and demands a substance to put the fire out that's going on inside of him, a neurological storm.
He calls to mind Romans 7 in a very literal way. Paul talking about the things he knows he doesn't want to do, he does.
That's right.
And I know you hinted about your own personal experience with addiction. Would you mind getting into that a little bit?
Yeah, I was using substances probably from 12 or 13, not regularly, but by the time I was 15, I was smoking pot every day, and then it got to harder drugs later on. I went out to California in the 60s, lived in Haight-Ashbury, and I ended up living all over the country, up in Boston and San Francisco and Berkeley, and it became part of who I was. It was like my purpose every day was to get my substance, and I had some real problems. I'd been in a coma for 10 days, Westchester County Medical Center. I think that was 1976 or something. And I remember a doctor sitting across from me. And I guess I came in, I was about 28 then. I came in at the same time somebody else did. And here I come out of this coma. My parents are outside. And this neurologist sits down with me and he says, I want to read your levels from the blood tests that they took when I came in. They were very high, and they were certainly at toxic levels. He said, you came in, another kid came after you that night. He died, and you didn't, and you're very lucky, because you really should be dead because your levels were so high of certain narcotics and stuff. And I could tell he was really well-intentioned. He was a very nice man. He was talking to me. He was sincere. I was like he was talking to the person next to me, right on my head. So I had that experience, and then I overdosed once, 3 times in 9 days. I woke up in 3 different hospitals.
Wow.
And then January 4th, 1987, I'm hard-headed. I hit a bottom, My union was bringing me upstate. And of course, if you're taking me to a hospital, I'm going to bring what I think I need with me in my pocket. Every time we stopped, I would take some of it and ended up overdosing in the car 10 minutes from Community General Hospital up in Sullivan County.
Wow.
And they saved my life again. Well, this time I woke up and I had Dr. D'Amico, who was a genius. He wrote the book, Massive Myths with Simple Solutions. He made 5 films about addiction. He was a wonderful guy, and he was a genius. In fact, you know, his rehab, his hospital, people came from all over the country to go there. And he didn't care how sick I was. I mean, I was in bed. I was there a month. But he made them wheel me around in a wheelchair after 2 weeks to go to his lectures. And his lectures were fascinating. And after that, I went to every Friday, him and I met. And I'd go sit in his lectures, and I used to bring people to them. But he's still, in my opinion, he is still the example for cutting-edge treatment for addiction. He was so far ahead of his time. That book, Massive Myths with Simple Solutions, debunks every single viewpoint on addiction that's fraudulent. And he explains it and he breaks it down so a 5-year-old can understand it. And he was a very charismatic guy. And he, of course, ran afoul of all the orthodoxy because he was outspoken about it. He had very strong moral opinions. He had a church in his home. He didn't believe that, you know, like he'd get women, you know, that had 5, 6 abortions, and he would say to them, you know, this is immoral. And the hospital got very upset about that. And this is back in 1987. Mm-hmm. But he made so much money for the hospital, but they did everything they could to destroy him. Eventually he got blackballed out of the field, and he taught for a while, and then he got Parkinson's disease. Mm-hmm. And about 9 years ago, he called me up, and I went up to his house, and all these people from the Scandinavian countries, of Finland, Norway, I think Sweden, and he had sent me his new research, and apparently they had implemented his, you know, paradigm for treatment all throughout these countries. And there was a whole string of rehabs that were based on his model. And his model, from the minute you walked in the door, every interaction was therapeutic to the day you left. Yeah. And it was very successful. And I was really happy to see, he was really happy that his information, which had been disseminated all over the world, had really been used to create a model like the program he created. He had a detox and rehab. And I was in the hospital a month, 29 days. And in that time, I got sicker than I've ever been in my life. I lost 24 pounds in 2.5 weeks. I was 136 pounds. And I didn't sleep. You know, I tell people this, it's not a record. Anybody's been in prison can tell you, if you come off methadone, you don't sleep for months. I didn't sleep for 57 days. You know, very worried because I was 38. My blood pressure would get very high. And I was still, you know, I was working out and doing things like that most of my life. And they said, one night, they said, we're going to give you some medication. You're going to sleep. I'll never forget it. This is when I went to the rehab. And I thought, wow, because I'd wake up, I'd be up all night. You know, when your brain is spinning all day and you can't sleep, it's just a difficult, rapacious kind of process. It's rather difficult. But before that, I had an experience, which I'll tell you about in a minute, but they gave me a ton of medication, nothing I would want to take, and I went in my room at 11 o'clock. They wheeled me in a wheelchair. And I was always in the room by myself because they couldn't put me with people because I'd be up all night. And I fell asleep. And I woke up. I went, wow. I was like blacking out. I went, wow. I thought I slept through the night. So I got myself out, wheeled myself out. The nurse was right outside my door. And it was like, I figured it's 5 in the morning. It was 11:20. I slept for 20 minutes. And that's the way my sleep came back. 20 minutes, a half an hour, 45 minutes. What I did at a year sober when I was living somewhere else, I was out of the hospital for a long time and out of the rehab. I started walking at the track. I'd go to the track in Yonkers. I'd fall asleep for an hour at 11 o'clock. Then I'd go to the track, say at 12 or 1, and I'd walk around the track. Winter, summer, I didn't care what it was. I'd wear a Carhartt in the winter, and I started jogging around it. Then I started running around, and I started working out at home. And I'd come back and get another hour's sleep. So I was getting 2-3 hours sleep a night. Went back to work in the union I was in, which was rigorous work, and I was doing okay. Got in really great shape from that. And I also understood, for me, the key to not sleeping at night was in the rehab was not to sit there and think I should be sleeping, I should be sleeping. I said to myself, I'm never going to get another opportunity to spend this much time rebuilding myself, remaking myself. What do I really want to do? So they brought my guitar up. My brother with my guitar. I brought up all the books I wanted to read. I read every author I ever wanted to read. And I was the only patient in the rehab. Rehab was 75 patients, and they added a new addition on, and it was 100 patients. It was a big place. It's right in Yorktown. It was Serenity Hill.
Oh, okay.
The Japanese bought it, became a country club, and now it's just a wreck. But I would go into, I was the only patient they'd let go into the day room in the middle of the night. They gave me permission. They'd wheel me in there, and I'd go in there, and I'd either read or play my guitar, or I'd watch Ben Casey. But every night I had stuff to do.
Is that where you is that where you happen to be exposed to the church?
Actually, the church, when I got out of there, a friend of mine who I helped get in treatment. He was in my union, and some people said, "Would you help him out?" And I said, "I can't get him sober, but I'll bring him to meetings." But we sent him to Arms Acres or someplace, and he said to me one day, we were going to meetings together. He said, "Do you have any spiritual literature?" It's a broad kind of category, but I went home, I looked through my stuff, and I found, and I had no idea how it got there. No idea. It came out a few years ago. Found Mystery of the Ages. So I didn't even read it. I just handed it to him. I said, "Try this out, George." And about a week later, he came to me and goes, "You know what this says?" I said, "I hope you don't mind, but I highlighted some things." And I opened the book, and he had highlighted in orange, "Man was made for a relationship with his creator." And I said, "Give me my book back." And I took the book back, and I started reading it. Yeah. And then I spoke to Steve Botha. I called different, the church. I got different ministers, and I began to converse with them. And then they invited me to come to church, and that was it. But long before I ever did that, I watched Mr. Armstrong in 1969, probably 68, 69.
Okay.
In Garner, Ted in California. I used to watch him on Sunday nights, and I was fascinated by him. I didn't know what he was talking about. I liked when he talked about Revelation, either one of them, but I was absolutely fascinated. There's something very charismatic and compelling about him. I enjoyed listening to him.
So that's interesting, actually. I won't get to it now. I have a quote by Carl Jung I wanted to run past you, which is very similar to that little snippet from Mystery of the Ages. But for people who are listening or watching and wondering, maybe they're listening and going, "Well, I'm not addicted to narcotics or alcohol or a substance of any sort. How does this apply to me?" I mean, you and I have talked about this a bunch. We talk about it at church quite a bit. But can you explain sort of or talk about the universality of addiction and compulsivity and how that works?
The crisis in our country, I only know our country, is compulsivity. Mm-hmm. I don't care what it is. We're compulsive people. It could be your iPhone. It could be the internet. It could be alcohol. It could be gambling. It could be pornography. And the best example I can give, this is when it really hit me, was many years ago when one of my kids was graduating from high school. I drove by the school and I thought, let me go and see what's going on. It was one of those last days of school when you say goodbye to people. It's a couple of hours. And the kids were coming out. Hundreds of kids were coming out. Every kid had his head down and was looking at his cell phone. And I thought, well, wow, what is so important that on this last day of school, they're not more involved with their friends? Who was calling? The president was calling. What was going on? It was so important.
And it could be right anger, responses to people. I mean, it's the whole. I'd imagine you talk about
perfectionism. People have a degree a need to be right. That's compulsivity.
Yep.
Workaholism is a compulsivity.
Need for relationships.
People, there's a million different ways.
Yeah, and I think the average person maybe doesn't view those things as a compulsivity or an addiction because it doesn't.
It's not harmful.
Yeah, it doesn't. It won't literally kill you, right? And I think maybe because one of the common experiences in addiction is also hitting bottom, right? And so I think a lot of those compulsivities or addictions probably do result in hitting bottom at some point. It's a social interaction, or your family starts to fall apart, or you have a relationship with a child that sours, or a spouse that gets worse. And I don't know if people see those moments as bottom. They just maybe see them as, well, that's what happens in marriage or something, or maybe they brush it off in the church rather than seeing it as part of a continuum of addiction and compulsivity and sin. I mean, that's the root of it.
Well, I guess, the interesting piece about it is that I think most people have some compulsivity. They don't recognize it as such. But they used to call the old days the codependent, the wife, spouse, parent, brother or sister of the alcoholic, the co-alcoholic, because they had a lot of the attitudes and behaviors. And the difference between, an alcoholic and the wife of an alcoholic is the wife of the alcoholic, she believes she can fix her husband, she's going to be fine. But of course, she's given up so much of her life, and so much of her consciousness has been taken up by concerns, worry, will he bring the money home for the paycheck? And they get into Al-Anon, and they have a very different way of working the same 12 steps. It's the same 12 steps, except the word alcohol is taken as step 1.
Yeah.
We admitted we're powerless over alcohol or drugs. That's the first step. Their first step is we admitted we're powerless over the alcohol. And what happens to them is very slow process going through the steps, because it's not life-threatening. But boy, it ruins their lives. I've seen it. I've seen people, I saw a lot of people in my private practice, and I've seen people marry an alcoholic 3 times. In spite of being in treatment and knowing better, it's mystification. They just, this person loves me, he's different, And then he gets behind the wheel of the car drinking, and they say, well, maybe he shouldn't be driving. And he doesn't pay any attention to that. And a couple of those, and a few months later, you're saying, well, what do you think? And they finally say, might be a problem. Does this feel familiar? They call it reification therapy. They're repeating a pattern over and over again.
And it seems like so many of these addictive or compulsive dynamics show themselves in the family dynamic, that, you might, maybe one person is abusing substances, but let's say there isn't. I mean, I know people who, and again, it might be confusing to some people to say it in this way, but people who are addicted to, or they always react with jealousy in a relationship, or they're always fearful that the person they're with is going to leave them because they've experienced abandonment growing up. Those are, I don't know if they fall into an addictive category, but they're ways that our minds are wired to go to a certain place. And it just seems like the full spectrum of addiction is much wider than people realize. And I like the point you brought up about how the members, very often the members of a household where there is someone who is addicted to a substance are just as much addicts, just to different things.
Well, it's very much systems theory, and it's so exact. It's hilarious. You get an alcoholic family, you get an alcoholic, husband's an alcoholic, the wife's codependent, they got 3 kids, and you will find the same exact roles in that family. You'll have a family hero who's an overachiever. You'll have a mascot who's always getting in trouble, and it's all to distract each one of them from the conflict that's going on between mom and dad that may have been brought about long before the alcoholism. But you see, that's why Bradshaw's work was so incredibly on target in the 80s. His film, Healing the Shame That Binds You, is just a wonderful film. And his book, that book is terrific.
Highly recommend to anyone listening. John Bradshaw,
changed my life.
Pretty much anything by John Bradshaw. I don't know if I spoke with you after, but I was on actually a Church of God Network trip and happened to bring Healing the Shame and read that and thought, because a lot of his work is around family dynamics, and I thought, well, am I really shame based? I don't feel like I am. We've talked that I consider myself an addict in a number of different ways that might not be substances, but I fully see myself through that lens, and I think most people should. But I remember reading the book and realizing that I actually absolutely was shame-based in a number of areas, and you don't, until someone puts the language and the verbiage behind explaining dynamics, you just don't see it.
Well, that was the thing that patients liked most, because for me, I did a whole thing on shame and the family dynamics. We do that for weeks. And I would kind of explain to them that, look, take these words, shame and guilt, and we're going to give them a new definition. Guilt is I made a mistake. I did something wrong. I didn't do something I should have done. That's about your behavior. Shame is I'm inherently flawed. I am a mistake. It's more about your very being. It's a feeling of inadequacy. And I met John Bradshaw, and I trained with him for a while, and everybody I ever met that I admired in the field says the same thing. The core of addiction is a sense of shame. And it starts long before you have any control over it. You get shame from your primary caregivers, mom, dad, whoever raised you, your brother, sister, or you can get it from your church. I went to church as a kid, and every Sunday was fire and brimstone. I thought, at 9 years old, I thought I'm condemned to hell. I'm never going to make it. You can get it from your peers. You get it from a variety of places.
Yeah. And it's so common, and correct me if I'm wrong, but like, you don't have to be there are a lot of people who struggle very consistently with self-esteem issues or self-loathing. I consider myself to not be someone who falls in that category, but I have recognized that I absolutely still am shame-based, and you could also be shame-based in certain areas, not others, correct?
Yeah. You know what I found really interesting? Here I'm working at this rehab, and we had I won't mention names, but we had the head of largest oil producing country in the world, and he was underneath the prince. And we had princes, and we had Moroccan princesses, and we had a lot of different people. We had people just under heads of state. We had a man who came who was picked for a cabinet position by Bush. We got a guy who was one of the nicest gentlemen I ever met. He was 70 years old. He was an alcoholic, but he did not drink before 3 o'clock, so he struggled. He was running the largest corporation in America then. I won't mention it because I didn't know who he was, but he was a billionaire. And the day I met him, he was on the board of 3 hospitals. My boss said to me, Bob, this is your patient. And on this unit, there are only 5 beds there. And there were big screen TVs and all that stuff and gourmet chefs. And so half the patients were mine on any given day, plus I had other patients. And he says, if this doesn't work out, he said, we're screwed, and I'm going to hang you out to dry. So this guy, I met him, really nice man. And I find that he's a billionaire, and he's on all these boards. And he's been the head of other big companies. And it was so interesting. I taught him about shame. And one day, he got this, it was his birthday. He'd been with us a month. And we had 8 tracks and DVD players there on the unit. You could play it in your room. And he had an 8-track. This is like 2001. An 8-track tape. So I put the tape in there. I want to show you something. I was going home. It was 4 o'clock. I want you to see this. And it was every well-known political leader, both parties, wishing him happy birthday with his sister. Happy birthday, so-and-so. I had a nickname. Happy birthday, so-and-so. And the last one was George W. Bush. Happy birthday, so-and-so. So I'm walking out, and I said, wow, it's pretty impressive. And I get out to my car, and I said, wait, I got to go back and talk to him. So I said, because I thought, you know what? I know who this guy is. I know how successful he is. First of all, he's a wonderful gentleman. I understand. And he came from nothing. He made his money. Nobody gave it to him.
Yeah.
And he's what I call dynamic, assertive. He leads because he's smarter than most people, and you want to follow him. He has good ideas. But the point is, he grew up in a family where his father was an addict from World War II, never got off of it, amputee, and he never had a childhood. He and his brother. He said, I come home and my mom would say, shh, your father's sleeping at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, so go back out and play, So he's a parentified child.
Yeah.
So I come back after looking at the tape, and I go back and I said, can I ask you a question? What motivated you to show me that particular video? He looked at me and I said, was it you wanted me to know who you were? And he looked at me and he gave a big sigh. He goes, you're absolutely right. And I said, well, I know. I said, not only do I know who you are, but know that you're a pretty genuine, authentic person who is underneath it is a great person. But I don't think you know that yet because you needed to impress me with that, that HR. And the whole month I worked with him, I knew all the stuff about him.
Yeah.
But he still had that button in him that said, wait a minute, I want him to know how important I am. And I said, that's the shame button. And he understood it immediately. In fact, after that, I treated his couple of his sons, and they all went to Wharton Business School and Yale and all that. But I treated his wife. They're really, really, he gave me a very, it was an educational viewpoint on people who are successful. Because when we started getting them, I thought we were going to get a bunch of entitled people, who are going to be very arrogant. And they weren't. They just weren't. He wasn't. So here's a guy had everything you could possibly want. Everything. Homes all over the world. His final remark to me, which kind of made me very envious. I said, is there anything that you regret in your life? And he said, I regret that I don't have another $100 million to leave my children.
Yeah.
He had 16 grandkids at that time. So
the amazing thing too is you touch on he wanted you to know who he was.
Yes.
That all the success still hadn't satiated that pride. And the more I live and the more I encounter things and the more I find parts of myself that I don't like, the more it all comes back to pride. And it sounds trite because I think everyone says it, but I remember a sermon from Gary Petty that I listened to a while ago. And he mentioned that we all, every person, right? And this obviously dates back to Satan and his rebellion, but as an outgrowth of that, every person, every human being thinks they are a god, a small g god, and everything that hits against that pride, right? That knocks you down, that insults you, that makes you feel lesser, it goes against the pride of this God, and a God can't be anything less than perfect. So it's all these things we do to try to, build up our own, build up our pride, or think that we're better, whatever it is, comparing ourselves to others, whatever the thing is. I mean, I've realized that about myself, how much my emotional state depends on how well I think I'm doing, and that's an illusion. And so contrary to what God wants from us.
Pascal called it the God-sized hole. And that's the thing that I always see, that no matter how successful, and you were going to talk about Carl Jung. Carl Jung corresponded with Bill Wilson, and he quoted, I believe it was the Psalm where he talked about the heart, the deer, panting for a drink of water. He said the alcoholic thirsts for a relationship with God or something greater than himself. After working with Roland, who got sober for a while and then relapsed, and Carl Jung had the decency when Roland said to him, okay, what do we do now? He said, well, I can't help you. And Roland was crestfallen. What do you mean you can't help me? You're the best psychiatric mind in the world. Mm-hmm. He said, I've seen alcoholics like you. You're the hopeless variety. I can't help you. He said, you never seen anybody like me get well? And Carl Jung said, no, I didn't say that. He said, I can't help you. What you need is a vital spiritual experience, and I can't bring it about.
And that person was the eventual founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, right?
No. Roland was a member. It was Bill W., Dr. Bob, Jim B., and another guy, I forgot. It was 4 original, but Bill and Bob. And Roland was a friend of Libby, who helped Bill get sober and then relapsed and later died. And Roland came in contact with AA and stayed sober for a while, but never really engaged in the principles and never really had any long-term sobriety.
Okay.
But he was a member in the early days. He was a very, very wealthy man, kind of went his own way.
I remember reading that story very recently, like that exact story, and I guess they cited it as
like Roland Hazard.
Yeah, like an early story that links Jung to Alcoholics Anonymous in some way. I assumed it was the founder, but I guess not. The quote I actually have, which is a great time to read it. So it's from Jung regarding one of his patients. So I'm assuming it's the same person. His craving for alcohol was the equivalent of the spiritual thirst of our being for wholeness, expressed as the union with God. Yeah. So I feel like a lot of people, even in the Church of God, ministers that I respect, have recognized that all sin, right? Addiction, compulsivity, sin in general, all sin, and all the different things we yearn for that aren't God, are our attempt at creating a pale substitute for that God-sized hole in us.
I realized that many years ago that I'd been looking. I was in Scientology in the '60s. I certainly took a lot of acid, but I was looking for that connection somehow, and it's not brought about. But they're just not going to find it in any of those places. It doesn't exist that way. It doesn't happen that way.
The amazing thing that I heard too was that hole, that God-sized hole in each one of us, it's actually never going to be filled until we're spirit. Right. Until we're spirit. Right. And that's a powerful recognition and revelation of sorts, but it's also, I don't want to say scary, but it's like, it's just, there's nothing you could do, right? I think it's built that way because it's made to have us continually yearn for God and struggle against that part of ourselves, like to make sure that we're trying to fill that hole with God and not other things until we die. And then that wholeness is only achieved when we're resurrected.
I always think of Hebrews when they talk about all the great men of the Bible who were pilgrims, foreigners. It was like, they got a shoe that was never going to fit them. And when my kids got old enough, I said, this life is not going to fit. It's not going to be what you think it is. It's not going to fit. And I'm here to tell you, to 72 years, it's not going to fit. That empty space, you can satiate, there's some things that will take away some of it. But
you distract. Yeah.
The things of this world You get to a point when you get to be as old as I am where you really stop desiring anything but your relationship with God, because there's God and not God, and everything else is not God. And it's not fulfilling, and it's not going to last, and it's not, there's things God give us that were good, certain institutions and stuff, but as far as, particularly with the successful, wealthy people, I'm not saying they're chasing it. Some of them just, like the doctor, these two doctors that patented a very famous procedure, they just kind of fell into it. They were just geniuses. But they, they do all the things that those people do. Now you're in a competitive race of more of everything. Your boat, you're placing France and this, that, and the other thing. And it's a very rare person that doesn't get drawn into that.
Yeah. We seem to have this, I've been thinking about this a lot lately. We seem to have this preoccupation with happiness or feeling a certain way. And if the last decade of my life, which is really like the first decade of adulthood for me, has taught me anything, is that that's a ridiculous goal to shoot for. This idea that you're just constantly happy and nothing's wrong. It's just, we have this illusion of how life is supposed to be. And, I think much of the compulsivity and addiction and trying to navigate this world, it results in those different things, whether it is addictions to substances or to the idea of finding a spouse. I see that phenomenon a lot amongst young people in the church, that there's this over focus on finding a spouse, and marriage is great. Like, it's a godly institution, but anything that we put as a substitute, or even just not even as a substitute, but our actions show we put in a higher position in the hierarchy than our pursuit of God, is problematic. And life is exhausting and super tough. And it's worse if we're involved in all these destructive addictions where we're trying to find substitutes for that God-sized hole. But even if we are following God by and large, day in and day out, we're not promised it's going to be easy. I mean, I think my dad said the other day, it says, pick up your cross and follow me. You don't get the cross doesn't get removed.
You know what? Scott Peck, beginning of his book, says life's difficult. Later on, he says life's a drizzle of small problems. I think, and you have to remember where we came from chronologically. I grew up in the 50s on fairy tales, which always had a happy ending. Yeah. I mean, that was the benchmark, and all of it was nonsense. So most people, if you ask them what they want, they say they want to be happy, as though that was some permanent emotional state you could grab and hold on to and keep with you on a regular basis every day, all day. And that's just so ridiculous. It's not possible. And if I always think about, I think it's in Proverbs where Solomon says, suffering opens the heart. That, suffering has a purpose. It makes us more understanding, more compassionate. We draw closer to others. We can then be there for others suffering. It's like, that's one of the problems with Alcoholics Anonymous, is they say, happy, joyous, and free. And it's almost like, I call it toxic positivity. It's, that's an illusion, and it's silly. No, life has ups and downs. It's a struggle a lot of the time, because this is not God's world. This is Satan's world. He's prince of the power of the air. Yeah. And this is not the way it's supposed to be now, but it wasn't the way it was intended.
Yeah. And also, just for people listening, Scott Peck, The Road Less Traveled, and other books by him, highly recommend those. I listened to People of the Lie.
People of the Lie, Different Drummer, all fantastic.
Not too long ago. A very impactful book. The interesting thing too is when you're in those states where it is a down point in life for whatever reason, whether it's something happened, it's a tragedy, whether it's just I guess cyclical or hormonal, maybe, whatever it is, at least I feel like if you take a step back and think about what's going on in your own mind, at least I've come to the conclusion how mentally and emotionally weak I am in terms of all the things that motivate, that come out when you're in those states. I've been trying to fast once a month. Jonathan Reedy gave that message a while back about various spiritual tools, and he mentioned fasting. So I've been trying to do that. And even something as small as taking away food for a day, it puts you in a certain mental state and it brings certain things to light, which is interesting. But when you get a major crisis in your life or a depressive state, I've realized how much a lot of what motivates me is this fear that I won't get something I think I want.
Well, you know what? The most profound statement I ever heard came 8 years ago from a guy in Alcoholics Anonymous. We're afraid of not getting what we want and losing what we have.
Yeah.
That's the core. Self-centered fear. That's the core of everything.
Yep.
That fear.
And it's, I think that's why, Scripture is replete with the admonitions to focus on the kingdom, to not love anything else before God, because I do. I mean, I'm not necessarily someone who has a lot of fears that go around in his head often, but there sometimes, like, depending on what's going on in life, you fear of losing a loved one or a situation, or by and large with me, it's not getting something that I want. And I've come to intellectually at least understand that as long as I'm pursuing my conversion relationship with God, all things work together for good. So even though I might be going through something terrible, or maybe a bad event's going to happen to me or my family in my life, God very well could be using that to get me or the other people in my life to where we need to be character-wise. That might be the catalyst that changes who we are, to help us be that stone that he needs to fit a very specific place in his kingdom. And that's go ahead.
The sermon on James, count it all joy when you fall into diverse temptations, that really was very helpful to me, because, I've always thought that in recovery that God doesn't waste a step, and that often my plan and his plan are very different, but his plan works out better than I expect.
Yep.
It just takes me a while to accept it, to see it, but I look at it that way, that this is for, some growth and change in me that God sees that needs to happen. I don't always see it. First of all, I don't have a choice. I have no choice in it.
Yeah.
I can resist all I want. It's not going to do me. I'm just going to be miserable. I need to surrender to that process, let myself, fully engage in it. But that's not an easy thing to do, letting go like that.
No, I was just talking to someone about that phenomenon. I know intellectually that is what is called for. I think I've experienced moments like that, but it is super difficult. Yeah. I'm still working on that surrender to God aspect of things. I do not pretend to know exactly what that entails or how to do it. But I think, like you said, part of it is that recognition that his plan is the one that works out for the best, not ours. Because a lot of it for me is, well, I have these things that I want in my life, right? And maybe they're not even bad things. They're not materialistic. They're just things that I want, and I feel like they're good to want. But I often try to take a step back and go, well, if I don't get that, but I'm still going through the process of conversion, and God gets me where he needs me to be at the end, that's a win. What makes me think that the thing that I want is going to do more to make me happy than what God wants for me. That's that odd dynamic where we think the thing, and it goes back to that feeling. I think that the inherent belief, subconscious belief that we're all gods, is that we think we know what's going to bring us happiness more than God does. It's firmly ingrained in who we are. And that's a big part of what we need to be shedding, is that idea that we know best. We know what's going to make us happy. Why isn't God giving me X thing?
Yeah, if we can maintain some kind of, certainty and control over things, it feels great. But the reality is we're really powerless over everything. The only thing I'm not powerless over is my reaction to things. And sometimes I'm even powerless over that. Yeah,
I was just going to say, it's an odd feeling to feel like you're not even really in control of yourself. And we are accountable when we sin. We're accountable when we screw up. But to think that we're a bunch of beings that have complete unfettered ability to just exercise what we think is right or wrong is not accurate. The science doesn't bear it out. The scripture doesn't bear it out. Romans doesn't bear it out. The example of David, it's this. I feel like the lack of control is one of the fundamental things in scripture, is that you don't have control. You barely have control of yourself, and very often you don't. That's why you need me. God speaking, obviously.
Well, it's always interesting to me, because we need some kind of certainty. I need to wake up and realize that tomorrow is going to be today. I know the roads and I know what I have to do, but the second human need seems to be unpredictability / variety, because with so much certainty.
Yeah.
One thing about addiction is it's doing the same thing over and over and over and over, expecting different results, but you're in a rut, and you get used to that rut. And after a while, it's just an endurance process. You're just enduring life. You're not living it.
Yeah.
So, variety is nice, but I think a long time ago, I figured out that the end of the game is not happiness. It's not about happiness.
Yeah.
And if I judge myself by my mood, I'm going to be miserable.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm not happy today. I'm not ecstatic for this brief period. I think God gives us peace. He gives us contentment, and He gives us the Holy Spirit gives us insight and understanding. And we start to realize, like, where we're off base, what's unrealistic and what's realistic. And I've had that breakthrough in the hospital. I had an experience that was very cathartic. And the problem with anything that's what you might call a spiritual awakening is once you've had one, you want to have other ones. Yeah. And I don't want to go through the process of getting near death to have that experience.
Yeah. Yeah, I could identify with that. I mean, it's maybe not near death. I haven't had near death experiences, but you have those experiences where you go, man, I'd really like to learn this, and I'd really like to not make an irrevocable mistake to learn it. I'd like to learn it from God in His mercy, not because my life is forever different now. You know what I mean?
I mean, God gave me my lowest point when I was in the hospital, and I couldn't move my right side. It's in the middle of the night. It was like I saw a flash of light. It was like I thought I had a stroke or something. Boom. And they knew something was wrong. And I was in the room by myself. I was in the hospital this time. They came in, and next thing you know, they wheeled me downstairs. And I hadn't prayed in years. Next morning, I said, God, I don't know if you're there. I don't really know if there's a God. I just said, please help me. And within a day, I had an experience that was, for me, completely unique. Because while I was in the hospital, I was very physically sick. You lose 24 pounds in 2 weeks. You can't eat. They want to feed you, feeding tube, all that stuff. My eyes unfocused. I couldn't read to see, none of that stuff. And your brain's going like crazy. And every bone in your body aches. It was like somebody, I remember it was, somebody tapped me on the head, and every bit of fear in my body and in my spirit drained out of me. And I didn't get physically better. It was like a tremendous sense of reassurance was given me where I knew I was going to be okay. I never knew I was going to be okay. Not since I was a kid. Yeah. And I thought, well, I'm going to be okay. I know it. And as soon as the doctor came to see me that day, Dr. D'Amico, he took a lot of time out for me. He said to me, you could see that my countenance has changed. What's going on? Is you feeling better? I said, no, I still feel terrible. I said, but all the fear, that psychological fear is gone. And what I feel now is a sense of reassurance. I know I'm going to be fine. So how do you know you're going to be fine? Did you hit the lottery? And I said, no. And he said, well, I said, I know, because first of all, I saw myself leaving here, walking out of here, which was what I insisted they let me do. I didn't want to be in a wheelchair, but I had to be in one. And I finally got up and walked out into a van and took me to the next place. But that to me was some kind of psychic experience that was a change. And I attribute it to God, but it wasn't in the church then.
And that's
my prayers were answered.
Yeah, that's an amazing thing, because I think what I've come to realize is that the faith God talks about is that kind of faith, the faith that it's going to be okay, that in the end God has your best interest in mind, and as long as we're pursuing that, the best outcome will happen, that God will bring us where we need to be. It's not that we have faith that this outcome we want is going to happen, and as long as we just have enough faith, that outcome is going to happen. I think it's the faith in God's process, that as long as we go through this, even if we keep failing and failing and failing, but keep getting back up and going through the process of conversion, that you will be fine, even if maybe some of those failures lead to a very big thing like a divorce or a death or whatever it is, or physical impairment as a result of something. That the faith of, yeah, I know I screwed up. Like, I know that I can't do this on my own. I know I have work to do with God, and that if I just keep at it, it'll be okay in the end. But it's I was thinking about this the other day. It's odd because many of the things we put in that God-sized hole are things that give us very intense temporary reprieve from the stresses or whatever is going on in our minds and our lives. It's a very big, serotonin boost, whatever it is, that is powerful and will get you through. Or it's that thing that whenever you're either stressed or bored, it's just the default thing you go into. Or it's the thing you're constantly searching for because that you think that's going to make you whole. When in reality, the true things that lead to the peace that you talk about is a relationship with God, but that doesn't offer the intense, immediate serotonin boost. It's like this long-term learned peace and contentment, which until you do it for a long time and learn these hard things, that it's not necessarily there. And I think because people look for these intense emotional experiences, sometimes that can be challenging.
Yeah, there's no quick fix.
Yeah.
With this, it's kind of a slow process, and that that was for me. It was an experience, but the process was still lasted weeks and weeks and months. And the other thing was, for me, God jump-started my life. Every problem I had, and I had a lot of them. I had no driver's license for 5 years. Never got a DWI. I got caught driving without insurance and stuff like that. The IRS after me for years. I hadn't done anything, paid taxes. Every one of those things was corrected in miraculous ways. I went to the Motor Vehicle Bureau, get a license after 5 years. Now, I'm going to pay a big fine, all that. They gave me a conditional license, and they said, you're not eligible for a license for at least a year. 2 weeks later, I got a license in the mail. Mm-hmm. I'm trying to be honest. I go back to Motor Vehicle. I said, you sent me this license. It's a regular license. And they spent an hour looking for it, and they said, no, you're entitled to that. When I went to the IRS, it turned out, because I hadn't filed tax returns in 6 or 7 years, that the contractors I worked for in the plumbing and welding unit had been taking out more money than was needed. So I got back. The IRS has a rule. They'll go back 3 years, 3 months, and 3 weeks if they owe you anything. After that, they don't have to pay you. So they said, well, figured it. I said, you're entitled to $5,500 from us in overpayment of taxes. But you're not going to get anything from 81 and 82 because I still had more money coming. Yeah. So I expected to owe them money, and they owed me money, and I eventually got a big check in the mail. Yeah. And it was just that kind of thing all the way along. And I needed that because I was so broken and I was just so shattered in pieces. And every challenge, there's a thing called state-dependent learning, which means that when you learn something in a particular state, it could be intoxication, it could be high. You don't have to be high all the time. It's just a different biochemical process with memory in your brain. When you learn that, the state you learn it in, you can't access that information unless you're in that state. Mm-hmm. I had a mechanic, I've seen it many times where people who are really good at something got sober, a month in the hospital, and they get out. Guy's a crackerjack mechanic. He has a foreign car place in Rye. And he calls me, he goes, Bob, I don't know whether to turn the wrench to the right or left. Because you learn that, he was a guy in service, he was a lifer for a while. He could fix everything from airplanes to a fan. And he learned it all in this process of drinking every day. And I'll tell you what, if you gave him a drink on that day when he said I didn't know whether to turn the wrench to the left or right, he'd know it in an instant. Because that biochemical key, that memory, is that substance connected to it, that mindset. That's what state-dependent learning is. And I began to realize there were a lot of things that I could not access. There were a lot of things, there were a lot of deficiencies, short-term memory loss, a lot of things, besides the sleep problems. And little by little, a lot of it came back, but some of it didn't. To this day, I always had a great memory. If I make an appointment for myself, I will inevitably write it down after I've remembered it. Say a day later, it's Tuesday, the June 10th, 11 o'clock. I'll put down, Tuesday, June 11th at 10 o'clock. I do it all the time. It's part of the damage that's been done. There's other areas that I realize that, I can't use substances for as long as I did not have long-term consequences. But most of them, I take pretty good care of myself. Most of them are, like I said, they're reversible, but you can improve in them. That's the good news. Anybody who has an addiction will get better if they stop. They can't help but get better if they stop.
Yeah. Along those lines, maybe for people, maybe the last thing we could talk about is for people who maybe, like we talked about, don't have an addiction to a substance, but maybe they do have destructive addictions or compulsivities in their life. Are there things that they can be on the lookout for in terms of, I know we've talked about things like, addiction is the removal of the space between impulse and action. I remember if that's the correct phrase. So
it's impulse, action, and the alcoholic or addict does not have the ability to interrupt that. So he doesn't have the power of choice. He goes right from impulse to action.
So are there, along those lines, like someone who has an addiction or compulsivity toward anger, who doesn't have that thought, that moment of thought between the impulse to be angry and the expression of it, are there things people can look for in themselves when they're trying to be introspective or they're being reflective that can help them identify these things in their life?
I think if you ask yourself, what are the things that bother me most that I do to myself or other people? And because first you have, at the beginning of any problem is awareness. You have to have your own awareness about it to where you can spot it coming up again. And I think what happens is as you spot it, oh, there it goes again, then it gets to the point where you're actually able to realize I'm about to do that. And now you have the power to intervene now. Maybe 1 time out of 10 you're going to do that.
Yeah.
But I think if you ask yourself, what are the behaviors that are troubling me or other people that I love around me to bring, I'm being told about. There's also process addictions and things like that. And that's probably where there's some kind of compulsive behavior, something going on that's, not life enhancing, life affirming. It's not, solidifying your relationships. It's really, tearing you down. Mm-hmm. Some crutch. We all have crutches, some kind of crutch somewhere.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Bob. I appreciate your time today. It's always fascinating to talk with you, and it's also always very helpful personally, regardless of what I'm going through at the time. So yeah, just thank you for coming on. I appreciate your insight.